At number 5 is, who else? Anderson Silva, the Spider, Chuck. What do you want to say about him? What defines his greatness? I'll tell you, for me, there's a lot of different things you can think about. You've been covering his career a long time, like I have. One of the major Brazilian stars is a way to look at this, but for me, I just think his peak was probably that Forrest Griffin fight. He started off his UFC run with a bang, beating Chris Lieben, and never took his foot off the gas for the most part up until the Weidman fight, I suppose. But it was the Forrest Griffin fight, and what defined his greatness was just the creative possibility. You just didn't know someone could paint a picture quite like that. It was breathtaking.
I think the thing with Anderson Silva for me was kind of the first rock star the UFC really had. I remember his entourage. He would walk around Vegas and there would be a trail of like 20 guys all following him to an event. He felt like the first big event for the UFC.
And to your point, talking about the celebrities knew who he was. Brazilian celebrity who played for one of my favorite teams, Real Madrid, Ronaldo, the soccer star Ronaldo, was in his entourage. He just and he was one of the guys, by the way, that crossed over in terms of sponsorship. It made a big difference there.
And also, remember the time Usher was giving him advice?
That's right.
Steven Seagal.
How can we forget?
We've seen that guy. He was the first guy who translated, I think, for celebrities. I remember Chuck Liddell back in the day had like some guy, people paying attention, but I think Anderson Silva was the first true compelling Matrix-like figure that the UFC ever had, who drew that compelling, not how, not if he was going to win, but just how long it was going to take for him to win.
Right, crossed boundaries outside of the octagon as a superstar in his home country as well as here, and then boundaries inside the octagon in terms of the possibility of what a person could do inside of the sport.
Number 4, Demetrius Johnson. What can you say about him? I mean, this is a guy who started off in the 135-pound division. He looked good there, but we thought when he moved to 125 pounds that the division was supposed to be for Joseph Benavidez or one of the other guys, and then as soon as that division starts, he has literally been the identifying factor for that division the whole way.
I'll never forget a time I talked with Matt Brown. It was just before his Stephen Thompson fight. It was a fight that Brown won, and he said something to me, and we were talking about Stephen Thompson, and he was saying, look, this guy's kickboxing record is undefeated. I mean, but he showed up when he was sick. He showed up when he was sad. He showed up when something didn't go right, and he just won and won and won. And Demetrius Johnson, I don't mean to bemoan the record in kickboxing of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, but what Demetrius was able to do in breaking Anderson Silva's record and beating all those guys one after the other, and by the way, incrementally more devastating than the next. It wasn't like it was getting harder. It got easier as time went along, is just so magnificent. I believe, Chuck, I don't know where you come down on this, jumping weight classes and taking super fights, obviously it's so difficult to do. But I think the hardest thing to do in MMA is to win a title and stand a post and say, all contenders come, and then to knock them down like that. It's just incredible.
Not to mention, he's a guy who fought against contentment. You never felt like he was complacent going into a fight. Even when he had to back it up, he had to beat certain guys multiple times. He always had that flair for dramatics. You remember the Horiguchi fight where there was like a second left on the clock when he basically finishes the fight. I just found Demetrius Johnson to be that guy who had a bigger hat of tricks than anybody else. I felt like he could get it done any way he wanted. But I think he always had that little bit of a chip on his shoulder, too, that he wanted to kind of prove himself as the great and to do something spectacular each time out. And nobody succeeded quite like him in the end. His record-breaking performance against Ray Bork being the standout moment of his career.
That's right. Yeah, and then, throwing him in the air and then catching him. The guy he tried to get into that Anderson Silva territory in terms of the creative reputation, and also with the record as well. But in the end, for me, he was a martial artist, a guy who, some people are great at trash talk and make it a big part of their game, and that's fine. There's a place for that inside MMA. But there's the biggest place, at least for me, and I think for a lot of other observers as well, for the guy who just goes to the gym, does what he's supposed to, and brings these talents to life as a professional. And very, very few ever did it better than him. Coming in at number 3 is one of the very few champs that's ever existed inside the UFC, Daniel Cormier. It's so easy to talk about all of his greatness. It really is. As a coach, you could say one, as a teammate, as a competitor, generally in athletics, but certainly, Chuck, as a fighter, as I mentioned, winning the light heavyweight title, winning and holding at the same time the heavyweight title, beating that heavyweight guy who was supposed to be the greatest of all time at that point, at least for the UFC anyway, rather easily, walking through and doing it without ever having to there was never a complaint about anything he had, any adversity he had to face. He just found a way to overcome.
Yeah, I feel like even going back before he ever got to the UFC, he's just an alternate in the Strikeforce Grand Prix. He comes in, he wins that thing, he hits the ground running as he comes into the UFC, and I'm not sure I ever pegged him to be as great as he's ended up being. You know, starting off 21 wins, one loss, one no contest to this point, but dominating. You know, ragdolling guys like Dan Henderson, submitting Anthony Johnson, taking away his power source twice. Just some of those feats. You just look at the aplomb in which he goes about his job. He makes it look easy, and at those weight divisions, to make winning in those divisions look easy and to win the belts, that's a feat in itself.
It was the Josh Barnett fight for me.
Yeah,
You're talking about
100%.
Strikeforce. When he lifted him into the air and then rotated him and winning that tournament, you thought, okay, he may have been the alternate, but I think the right guy won this tournament. And by the way, beyond that, to be an Olympian as a captain of the team and to have those credentials, you never worried about how MMA would look in Daniel Cormier's hands. It was always safe. It was always something you could just count on. And then, if he needed to sell a fight, he could do that. If he needed to find a contender, he could do that. He was basically a renaissance man, I think, inside of MMA.
He was never an imposing looking fighter, but he might be the most dominant, non-imposing looking fighter we've ever seen. I think the big thing for me was we knew he could wrestle going in, but just watching him evolve as time went on, where his power and his hands started to develop. You see him in scrambles, and you'd see him in weird situations where you saw him outthinking his opposition. To me, there's probably not a more well-rounded fighter who has one sublime trait being his wrestling, but as well-rounded on all the other levels as Daniel Cormier.
And look, the John Jones fights, you have to count them. You cannot ignore parts of a person's resume because it's inconvenient for a narrative. But I firmly believe, even counting those, yes, the other overall body of work is so significant, so good, so dominant, so thorough, so consistent with that Gustafsson fight, gritting it out, being hurt, but still finding a way, as you mentioned, taking Anthony Johnson's power and everything else in between, sometimes making it look like light work. Daniel Cormier is truly one of MMA's greats.
Number 2, John Jones. I don't know about you, Luke, but this is one of the few guys that I felt like you could see coming from his very first fight, which was, I think, at UFC 87, when he was fighting
Andre
Guzman. And you could just see already, the kid was like 20 years old at the time. You knew just from watching him in the cage, you could tell from that very first fight that he was going to be something special. And I remember specifically when I think it was UFC 100, and he was on the prelims, I believe it was, against Stephan Bonnar. And you were seeing him do suplexes and spinning stuff and just landing, and it was like he was freelancing, having fun, and it came so easy for him. I thought at that moment that he would be a champion, and that's exactly what he became.
When I first saw what he was doing, I looked at it, and he was doing the kinds of things, as you mentioned, not just high amplitude throws or these reckless attacks, but he was doing other things in a fight and having a level of success that you would almost only ever associate with someone who was a veteran. These are not possible until you have much further mastered the game. And he was doing them with very little training and at a very young age, and you thought that shouldn't be possible. This is not how the sport actually works. And it did. And he just kept putting one win after the other on top of it. I remember I was always a believer, especially after the Guzman win. I mean, I guess when he came in I wasn't, but after that, certainly. But I remember there was the big turning point in my eyes. There's probably a couple of them. The Brandon Vera win when he broke his face was hard to watch, quite literally. But certainly beating Rampage in the way he did, and then beating Rashad in the way he did. But I think the big one was I kind of wondered how the weirdness of Lyoto Machida might work. And then he just left him eyes open on the canvas. I couldn't believe what I was looking at.
Yeah, and he always obviously has a lot of complex narratives and story points. But, if you remember, he was the pastor's son, and he used to always go out and meditate in the parks and do these things. And remember his Shogun Rua fight when he became the youngest champion. He was stopping a robbery or a burglar right before that fight in Paterson, New Jersey. And it just tells you something about the kind of prowess this guy was dealing in and the kind of attitude he had as he came in. And let's not forget, he was the first guy to really garner big-time sponsors, the kind that the UFC could never sniff. I remember when he was fighting Alexander Gustafsson, he shows up wearing Nike and Gatorade on both sides of his shorts, and you're thinking at the time, like, this is the Michael Jordan of our sport.
That's right. Look, he had his issues. There's no denying it. That is also part of his record. Less so inside the octagon, but there was some time missed, and you have to wonder, what else there could have been. But what's amazing about that is even with the time off, you still look at the record of achievement and you say to yourself, my God, this guy has missed significant chunks of his career, and his resume is still borderline perfect. That is how crazy it is. He beat the best of his generation, all of them relatively easily, the Gustafsson fight certainly notwithstanding. And now, coming back, you have to wonder, can he add to this chapter? And if he can, what other heights are still attainable for a guy who the game came natural to and also got started young? It's not great, but you can take time off and still be something utterly spectacular.
Yeah, if he doesn't have his problems that he does, he's a slam dunk GOAT. I don't think there'd be any conversation. He would be the greatest of all time, and it wouldn't be close. He'd be 10 feet above the next competitor.
And last, certainly not least, coming in at number 1, the great Canadian himself, Rush. Georges St-Pierre. Man, Chuck, the superlatives. All the guys we've talked about today, there are so many incredible things you can say. But George he's about as close to the perfect fighter as you're probably ever going to get. And what do I mean by that? Yeah, he had a couple of losses. You know, he got armbar. Always the mats give him trouble. The mat he uses in the Mat Saras. But he overcame those as well. But it's not just a record of achievement, I think, beating 3 generations of welterweights and then going away from the game and coming back and beating Michael Bisping, as we talked about a little while ago, once on the MMA beat. He just wins belts, holds them, and then gives them back after a period of time. No one ever really is able to take it from him. But to be a professional in the way he was outside the octagon, to never have financial worry, to be an innovator in training, to be somebody who just, what are all of the pieces of the puzzle that you have to get right? He just got them all right.
He was the first poster boy for the UFC. I really believe he was the guy that the UFC could rely upon to convince people that this was not a crazy, barbaric, taboo sport, but an actual sport with discipline and professionalism at the top. And I think that Georges St-Pierre was not only able to do that, but he was able to back up for years. Being the welterweight champion of the UFC, he was able to, to carry that momentum for so long without ever losing a fight. And all these guys that came up, and I think you'd agree, the welterweight division being probably one of the hardest divisions there is. And,
absolutely.
And realizing big events like UFC 129, where there's 55,000 people showing up in Toronto to watch him fight a guy like Jake Shields. I think that was all just a testament to the bigness of Georges St-Pierre. There was a moment where just those initials, GSP, said everything you wanted to know about MMA.
And what's interesting to me is, you'll talk about him as a fighter, right? Here was a guy, I mentioned how lengthy his wins streak was and how many times he got tested. No one ever came up with the answer. If you wanted to strike with him, fine. You want to play the ground game with him, fine. The in-between space, fine. He was strategically smart. Against Koscheck, could sit behind the jab. Even when he got rocked against Condit, he could go and find the wrestling. What was amazing was even the other wrestlers were like, look, only the Americans, the Russians, the Iranians, we can wrestle. The rest of Europe can't really wrestle, and certainly the Canadians don't have a reputation. He didn't grow up wrestling and was out wrestling all of those guys. His ability to just do things that you needed to do. Someone once told me this in MMA. It's like, imagine, like, what should you do in any kind of combative scenario?
And he burned very quietly and very professional, like you mentioned. I think he wanted it more, and you would see him in a build-up to a fight that he was putting it into his mind. I think he sort of hated fighting to an extent. I don't think he really cherished the idea, but he was obsessed with the idea of being great. And I think that those are the guys sometimes that they become interesting studies over the course of time because they're able to basically weather all adversity in a fight. I remember when he got hit pretty good against Carlos Condit, and it was in Montreal, and I thought for just a second that we were about to see the upset, and you could see him recalibrating, putting himself back together, and then slowly taking the fight again. I remember just thinking at the time, I was like, this is a guy, if you do scatter his wits, he picks them back up and puts them together immediately, and he just knows what to do. I think he had wired his instincts to really deal with all the elements of MMA.
Everyone who said they were going to do something outside of the first Serra fight, all of their arguments proved to be false. Guys saying, oh, he's an athlete, he's not a fighter, never proved to be true. He was able to bring competitive spirit in the way you're talking about that few folks had. And by the way, as I mentioned with Demetrius Johnson, winning a title and standing a post and being able to do that against the kind of crop of murderers that he ever did, and doing it in big fights at UFC 100, at UFC 129. There was so many others, and doing it in Montreal. He was a regional star. He was an international star. I don't know what there is to say, Chuck, but for my money, Georges St-Pierre is the best fighter we've ever seen.